Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got Commander's Guild deck number 197 and it's titled How Do I Hold All These Experience Counters? And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card is a random card, not a suggested one, and that is going to be Azlask the Swelling Scourge. And Azlask is 3 mana for a 2/2 legendary creature Eldrazi. Whenever Azlask the Swelling Scourge or another colorless creature you control dies, you get an experience counter. Then you can spend a white, blue, black, red, and green. And creatures you control get +X until the end of turn, where X is the number of experience counters you have. Scions and Spawns you control gain Indestructible and Annihilator 1 until the end of turn. So a bit of an unspoken rule here on the Commander's Guild is that if we get a legendary creature or some other card that is legal to be our commander as our random card of the week, then we might as well make it the commander because, how else can we really build around a card unless it's in the command zone? And so with Azlask, even though it's 3 colorless mana for the casting cost, it is actually a 5-color commander thanks to its activated ability. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about some of the themes of the deck and break down what exactly it is we're trying to do. So first up, we have experience counters. Azlask is the first 5-color experience counter commander, so that means we can play all of the other experience counter commanders in the deck, and they should all be able to work with the same experience counters, and while they may not necessarily care about all of the same things, they should at least care about the counters, which is something we should be able to rack up quite a bit of if we're playing every single experience counter creature that exists. So, a good example of that is Meren of Clan Nel Toth, which is 2 black-green for a 3/4 legendary creature human shaman. Whenever another creature you control dies, you get an experience counter, and at the beginning of your end step, choose target creature card in your graveyard. If that card's mana value is less than or equal to the number of experience counters you have, return it to the battlefield, otherwise put it into your hand. Now, Meren is one of the most famous, or possibly infamous, depending on your playgroup, commander that has experience counters, because there are a ton of value loops that you can do with her, just killing off creatures, putting them in the graveyard, getting back giant creatures with enter the battlefield effects, or some other sort of value synergies that are going on. We're not really leaning into that all that much, but it is worth noting that she says we get an experience counter whenever another creature we control dies, and there are going to be a lot of creatures dying under our control, which we'll get to in a second. I don't really want to spoil that, but that is going to be one of the most efficient ways for us to generate experience counters. And like I said earlier, if one creature creates an experience counter, they all work for the same thing. We don't have experience counters specifically for Meren or specifically for Azlask. They're going to actually use the same pool of counters for their abilities, which makes this significantly more powerful. Moving on, though, we get to our next theme, which is going to be Eldrazi. And not specifically Eldrazi creatures, so we're not playing things like Ulamog or Emrakul or Kozilek. We want to focus in on spawns and scions. And because we're doing that, that's another great way for Meren to trigger. She doesn't care about non-token creatures dying, she just wants creatures to die. And scions and spawns can sacrifice themselves to make a colorless mana. That is also a colorless creature dying. That also triggers Azlask to make more experience counters. And with the Scions and the Spawns, they are going to be getting Indestructible and Annihilator when we attack with Azlask if we've activated his ability. So that is one of the main reasons we want to lean into those Eldrazi tokens, and one of the best generators of those tokens is going to be Writhing Chrysalis, which is 2 red-green for a 2/3 Eldrazi drone, although it is technically devoid, so even though we have to spend red and green to cast it, it is a colorless spell, so it does still trigger Azlask when it dies. And when we cast the spell, we create 2 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens with sacrifice this creature, add a colorless. It has reach, And whenever we sacrifice another Eldrazi, put a +1/+1 counter on Writhing Chrysalis. If you played any Modern Horizons 3 Limited, you probably know that this thing was an absolute nightmare on the battlefield. It is not quite as bad in Commander, but it is still very strong, because if we have, say, Writhing Chrysalis, Marin, and Azlask on play, then we just sacrifice a single token, we put a +1/+1 counter on the Chrysalis, and we get 2 experience counters, and if we can get to the point where we have 4 experience counters and a way to sacrifice things, we can just sacrifice the Chrysalis and then bring it back with Marin to get more spawns, and then, of course, that lets us sacrifice more of our own creatures and get more experience counters. And it's very quickly going to get out of hand because there's no real limit to the things we can do with our experience counters as long as we have a ton of them. And that leads us into our third theme, which is going to be proliferate. Since we're focused pretty heavily on these counters, we may as well use the ability that lets us increase our counters by just doing other things in the game. And so a great example of that is going to be Experimental Augury, which is 1 and a blue for an instant. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand and the rest on the bottom, and then proliferate. So we kind of get to dig for the cards that we're looking for. It's going to replace itself. It doesn't technically draw cards, but it's just putting 1 into our hand even though we spent a card, so we're kind of net neutral there. But the more important piece is that proliferation. And we're most likely going to be using it for our experience counters because we have so many creatures that care about them. But we also do have a handful of creatures that care about things like +1/+1 counters, like the Writhing Chrysalis. So there is a chance that we use it for other things as well. Otherwise, it's just kind of a main value piece of this deck to make sure that we can go over the top of whatever our opponents are doing. So with all of that being said, those are our themes for this week. And the next thing I want to do is take a look at some key cards in this deck. These are cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do, and in some cases can be value engines or win conditions all on their own. So the very first one that I want to talk about is going to be Propagator Drone. And Propagator Drone is 1 and a green for a 2/2 Eldrazi drone. It is, again, devoid, so it has no color. And creature tokens you control have evolve. So whenever a creature enters the battlefield, if it has a greater power or toughness than the token, you put a +1/+1 counter on the token. And then it can also pay 3 and a green to create a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn token. Now, looking at this, you might think it's not that great because if we're making a ton of spawn or a ton of scions, they're not really going to trigger evolve on each other because they're either 0/1s or 1/1s. Although, I guess in that case, the spawn could put a counter on the scion, or the other way around, I guess. I don't know. There's spawns and scions. One of them's a 0/1, one's a 1/1. One of them will evolve the other. But the main reason it's here is because if we have, say, 10 Eldrazi tokens, all we really have to do is play a 1/1 creature or a 2/2 creature, and all of a sudden they're all going to get a +1/+1 counter, and it doesn't take us very long to turn them into a massive threat. Because if we go from a board of 0/1s to a board of 3/4s, we are, well, I was going to say tripling our damage output, but that's not technically how multiplying by 0 works. You understand what I'm saying, though. We're doing a lot more damage if we're evolving all of our tokens. So I do think that that is going to be a key piece of this deck, trying to make sure that we can constantly pump through damage, and of course giving us the ability to activate Azlask pretty much at any point and put our opponents in a losing situation, because if we just have enough scions, they're going to have to block some of them. They might be too big. They might also have Indestructible and Annihilator, so there's a lot we can do if our creatures are lethal threats on their own. Moving on, though, to our second key card. This one is Dreamtide Whale. Now, I've played Dreamtide Whale against a couple of decks at this point, and I've also played it in a couple of decks at this point, so I think that it's one of the most effective proliferate engines that has been printed in a long time, if not the most effective proliferate engine, because it is 2 and a blue for a 7/5 whale. It has Vanishing 2, and whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, proliferate. There is a very good chance that in a game of Commander, this will proliferate on every player's turn around the table, letting you proliferate 4 times around the table. And so the Vanishing 2 is almost never going to be a problem. This is pretty much never going to die to its vanishing counters, because worst case scenario, we can proliferate it as well without using its own ability, so we can keep it around. But this is going to be giving us a huge influx of our experience counters and really just send things like Marin and Azlask way over the top of what our opponents are expecting, because on our turn we may have, for example, 4 experience counters, but by the time it gets back to us we could have 8. And that's through nothing we've done. We've just kind of let our opponents do their thing. We've just sat there, maybe hold up some interaction. But Dreamtide Whale is a huge value piece and is one of those cards that doesn't look like too much on the front, but once you've played it or played against it a couple of times, it really shows how powerful it is. Moving on to our final key card. This is one of my personal experience counter cards, and that is Othari Sun's Glory. And Othari is 3 red, white for a 3/3 Phoenix. It has flying, lifelink, and haste, and whenever it attacks, you get an experience counter. Then create a 2/2 red rebel creature token that's tapped and attacking for each experience counter you have. And you can pay 2 a red and a white to tap an untapped rebel you control and return Othari from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So we built a deck around Othari a while back that was a ton of fun and really focused in on combats and being able to get in for additional combats with the rebels and dealing damage. And while we're not super focused on that in this deck, Othari being able to get an experience counter whenever it attacks, and then also making creatures for every single experience counter we have, means that if we can generate, say, even just 5 experience counters, all of a sudden we're making 5 2/2s and putting 10 damage on the board kind of out of nowhere, especially because Othari has haste. We can drop it, immediately swing, and hit our opponents for a lot more damage than they were expecting. Plus, this is a good way to consistently generate experience counters, or possibly even our first experience counter if we're at a point in the game where we haven't been able to get any, and then our proliferate effects come into play and we get to the point where we're making so many rebel tokens that our opponents aren't able to do much to stop it, because if they kill Othari, we can just pay 4 mana, tap a rebel, and bring it back, and then continue the train again. So Othari really puts in a lot of work, and I've never seen it hit the board and not heard a bit of a groan from our opponents. But anyway, those are all of our key cards, and the next thing we're going to do is take a look at some cool interactions in this deck. So these are cards that synergize really well with each other, and in some case are just fun cards that I want to highlight because they don't get a lot of love otherwise. So the first pair of cards that I want to talk about is going to be Ragga-Dragga Gorgut's Boss and Awakening Zone. So Ragga-Dragga is 2 red-green for a 4/4 human boar. Each creature you control with a mana ability gets +2/+2. Whenever a creature you control with a mana ability attacks, untap it, and whenever you cast a spell, if at least 7 mana was spent to cast it, untap target creature, it gets +7/+7 and gains trample until the end of turn. Awakening Zone is 2 and a green for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi Spawn token onto the battlefield. Notably, Eldrazi Spawn and Eldrazi Scions have an ability to sacrifice themselves and add 1 mana to your mana pool, which is a mana ability, meaning Ragga-Dragga does give them all +2/+2. This is a really simple way for us to just dish out a ton of damage, because Awakening Zone is going to be making, with Ragga-Dragga, essentially a 2/3 for free every single turn. We can attack with them, we can untap them, and then we can also sacrifice some of them to pay for something that might be 7 or more mana with Ragga-Dragga, giving another Scion or Spawn +7/+7 in trample, or maybe even something else. So this has a ton of potential to just kind of be a blowout for our opponents and put them in a position where they either kind of have to block a board of not necessarily massive Scions and Spawns, but bigger Scions and Spawns, and also risk the fact that we could at any point just make something absolutely massive and crash through for even more damage. So kind of like we talked about earlier with some of our cards, the idea here is just to put pressure on our opponents. And I think that by providing, like I said, what is essentially a free 2/3 every single turn, I think Awakening Zone and Raga Draga can more than put the pressure on. Moving on, though, to our next cool interaction. This one is going to be between Glaring Fleshraker and Kozilek's Command. Glaring Fleshraker, another kind of MVP for the deck. It's a 2 and a colorless for a 2/2 Eldrazi drone. Whenever you cast a colorless spell, create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature, add a colorless. And whenever another colorless creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. Kozilek's Command is X and 2 colorless for a Kindred instant Eldrazi, and when you cast it, you choose 2. Target player creates X 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens. Target player scries X, then draws a card. Exile target creature with mana value X or less, and exile up to X target cards from graveyards. So the main reason that this is going to be so good is because if we have the Fleshraker in play and say 10 spawn tokens just kind of sitting around, we could potentially cast Kozilek's Command for X equals 10 to make 10 more spawn tokens, so we could essentially sacrifice all of our spawns and just immediately replace them. That's going to make us an additional spawn with the Fleshraker, and when every single one of those spawns enters the battlefield, it's going to do 1 damage to each opponent, doing 11 total damage to each of our opponents. There are plenty of conditions where this just wins the game outright, because we can cast Kozilek's Command for a ton of mana, and if we're doing that, then we can very easily make a ton of Eldrazi and then win the game with Glaring Fleshraker. Plus, the nice thing about Kozilek's Command, and the reason it is the second most expensive card in the entire deck, is because we also get to choose a second ability on there. We can scry and draw a card, we can exile a creature, it acts as graveyard hate. Kozilek's Command is definitely one of the best cards in the entire deck, and all it takes is a little push from the Fleshraker to make it a win condition as well. So those are all of our cool interactions in this deck, and the next thing I want to do is take a look at the price of the deck. So as I mentioned earlier, our total budget is $100 or less, and this week we came in at $86.47, with our most expensive card being All Will Be One at $11.56. So All Will Be One is 3 and 2 red for an enchantment. Whenever you put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, All Will Be One deals that much damage to target opponent, creature an opponent controls, or planeswalker an opponent controls. So the main reason that this is in here is because we want to lean so hard into getting experience counters, because if we can proliferate our counters, we may only get 1 at a time, but that 1 at a time can very quickly add up when we can do damage divided kind of around the board however we choose. We might be able to use this to get a little bit more damage in on an opponent. We might be able to take out some planeswalkers or some key combo creatures or defenders even. So All Will Be One has a ton of potential in the deck when we're focused in on counters, but it is a massive $11.56. So if you do need to trim for budget purposes, you could cut out All Will Be One and drop the deck price to about $75, which is more manageable than $86, even though it's still not that cheap, but it is worth including if you're able to do so. On the other hand, I do also have a suggestion for an out-of-budget upgrade and what I would replace it with if you don't mind spending a little bit more to improve the deck. And that out-of-budget upgrade this time is Banner of Kinship, a relatively new card from Foundations. It is 5 mana for an artifact. As it enters, choose a creature type. It's probably going to be Spawn, Scion, maybe Eldrazi. And this artifact enters with a Fellowship counter on it for each creature you control of the chosen type, and creatures you control of the chosen type get a +1/+1 for each Fellowship counter on this artifact. This plays into our game plan actually in a couple of different ways. The first is that if we have just 5 Eldrazi in play when we cast this, we put 5 counters on it. Now all of our Eldrazi are getting +5/+5, which is a massive boost to what we're trying to do. There's also times when maybe we even name Rebel because we've got Nothari to go off a couple of times, and maybe some other things here and there, but it's most likely going to be Eldrazi. The second part of this card, and what makes it perfect for this deck, is that it gets counters put on it. Counters that can be proliferated. So if we continuously proliferate the counters on the Banner of Kinship, it doesn't matter if we start with just 1, we could get it up to 5, 10, 15 counters throughout the course of the game. And at that point, if our opponents are getting +15/+15 from each creature, they're not going to be in the game for very long. Our opponents are going to get knocked out very quickly by a massive board of just kind of Eldrazi tokens. And that's not really something people expect, especially because it comes into effect immediately once we drop it. So I do think Banner of Kinship does a very good job of finishing the game, but it is kind of expensive, $5.80. I do expect that this will probably go up, so if you are looking to get it, I would recommend it. I imagine this is going to be a staple in Kindred Commander decks for quite a while. However, though, if you are putting a Banner of Kinship into your deck, you would of course have to take a card out. And in this case, I would recommend taking out Warped Tusker, which is a 7-mana 6/8 Eldrazi Boar Beast. It has reach. When you cast or cycle Warped Tusker, create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature, add a colorless, and it has cycling for 2 and a green. So this is in here mainly because it does make a token, it cycles, it's an expensive Eldrazi that we can cast late in the game, but it's not a key piece in anything we want to be doing. It's not proliferating, it's not dealing with experience counters, and it only makes a single spawn whether we cycle it or cast it. So while Warped Tusker can be good, once it hits the board, it's just a 6/8 with reach, and as much as I would love to say that that is a powerful card, it's not really what we want to be doing. So I do think it's good, but I don't think it's where we want to be for the deck. So that's why I would recommend swapping it out for Banner of Kinship if given the chance. But with all of that being said, and before we get into the game with this deck, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. And as always, give a shout out to all of our current patrons and channel members. So I have been expanding our social media presence in the last few months, so if you're interested, please do check us out on some of our newer accounts. I would love to see our fan bases grow over there as well. And if you would like to support the channel, you can, as always, just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That is also amazing. But you can also find us over on Patreon or right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you get things like the deck lists a week early. You get access to a Discord where we brew up a lot of the games and also play the games that show up on the channel, as well as the decks themselves. And then, of course, you get the unedited gameplay videos. You get the guarantee from me that any card you suggest will be turned into a video for the channel eventually. Might take me a little bit, but I will get there. So a quick shout out to all of our current patrons and channel members. A thank you going out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boost, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Keegan Tawny, Jakar, and Galen. So to all of you, thank you all so much. And before we jump into the game, I do have one last quick announcement. I talked about this last week, but just in case you missed it, we are now affiliated with Shipping Shield. So if you are interested in shipping out some cards, we do have some codes that you can put in to get a bit of a discount. I know that I'm planning to use them in the future, so if you have any interest at all, please do use our codes. You can use each code 3 times. Or use the affiliate code. Once you've clicked on that, they know that we sent you over there, and we get a little bit in return. So thank you to Shipping Shield for this amazing partnership. And hopefully, like I said, if you guys are sending out any cards, hopefully these are the way to do it. But with all of the shout outs out of the way, now is the time to see if our experience counter Eldrazi deck can get the job done in a game. So this week, we are joined by 3 opponents. We have Vintage playing Archelos Lagoon Mystic, we have Jason playing Xyrus the Writhing Storm, and Bilal playing Sorin of House Markov. So starting off with Vintage and his Archelos deck, this is kind of a, I don't want to say prison because that feels like a harsh word, but his goal is to tap down his opponent's creatures and then make sure that they don't untap. And then that lets him kind of get in through combat and deal some shenanigans with his creatures being tapped or untapped depending on Archelos. So it's a very unique concept for Archelos, and I'm very excited to see what he can do. We've been brewing this up a little bit in Discord for a while, and I know he's very excited to get it out and see how it does. Moving on to Jason and his Xyrus deck. This is also a relatively newer deck for Jason. I don't think I've played against his Xyrus deck in particular, but I imagine, knowing Jason, it is full of wheels, it's full of tokens, and it's full of ways to do damage. So I am a little bit concerned about this one because obviously we are also trying to make tokens, so hopefully he doesn't go wider than we do, but we'll see. I'm sure there's some shenanigans in there. And then last but not least, we have Bilal playing Sorin, and if you missed last week's video, there was a Sorin deck in that game as well. But this is a very powerful commander. Every time I see it played, it just feels so incredibly strong. And it's really not for the front of the card, it's just a 1/4 with lifelink and extort. But it's mainly for the back of the card. Once it transforms into Sorin Ravenous Neonate, being able to -1 to do damage equal to the life you've gained this turn is enough to just close out games, because there's plenty of cards out there like Exsanguinate or Debt to the Deathless that just let you gain an absurd amount of life, and then you can just, knock someone out of the game with it. So I am very concerned about Sorin. Like I said, every time I play against it, it's just kind of that fear hanging over you the whole game of, I could die at any moment if they gain a bunch of life. So that is, I think, probably the most concerning deck at the table. I'm not sure if I'm more specifically scared of that or of Xyrus, or even the mystery behind whatever is happening with Archelos, because I'm still not 100% sure if we can handle the tapping effects. But regardless of what happens, we will see how it goes. Get your predictions in now. Who do you think is going to win the game? Do you think that we can close it out? Do you think it'll be the turtle, the snake, or the vampire? So let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. I hope you will enjoy the game. I'm sure I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Vintage goes first, followed by myself, Jason, and then Bilal. Before the game begins, though, I put a Leyline of Transformation into play since it was in my starting hand, turning all my creatures into Scions in addition to their other types. Vintage then plays an island. I play a Gonda Gate, letting all my gates enter untapped. Jason plays a Rugged Highlands, gaining a life. Bilal plays a Swamp. Vintage plays a Swamp. I play a Simic Guildgate and cast Basking Rootscale, which has Adapt 1, and creates a 0/1 Eldrazi Spawn token whenever a +1/+1 counter is put onto it. Jason plays an island and casts Mindstone. Bilal plays a Vault of Champions and casts his commander, Sorin of House Markov, which has Extort, and transforms in his second main phase if Bilal has gained 3 or more life this turn. Vintage plays an Exotic Orchard and casts Wall of Frost, preventing any creature that's blocked by it from untapping in their controller's next untap step. I play a Dimir Guildgate and attack Jason for 1. Then, in my second main phase, I cast my commander, Azlask the Swelling Scourge, giving me an experience counter whenever a colorless creature I control dies, and letting me pay 5 mana to give all my creatures +X/+X, where X is the number of experience counters I have, also giving Scions and Spawns Indestructible and Annihilator 1. Jason plays a Forest and casts Goblin Bombardment, letting him sacrifice a creature to do 1 damage to any target. Bilal plays a Plains and casts a Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size. Vintage plays an island and casts Tasha's Hideous Laughter, making each opponent exile cards from the top of their library until they've exiled 20 or more mana value worth of cards. I play a Citadel Gate, naming red, so it taps for red and white. Then I attack Bilal for 4 with both of my creatures, but he blocks Azlask, taking only 2, while no creatures die in combat. Then, in my second main phase, I cast Kalemni, Disciple of Iroas, which gives me an experience counter when I cast a creature with mana value 5 or greater, and it also gets +1/+1 for each experience counter I have. Jason plays a Storm-Carved Coast, and then casts his own commander, Xyrus the Writhing Storm, letting him make a 1/1 snake token whenever an opponent draws a card, except for the first one they draw in their draw steps, and also, when it deals combat damage to an opponent, lets Jason and the defending player draw cards equal to the damage dealt. Bilal plays a Swamp and casts Tivash Gloom Summoner, letting him pay life in his end step equal to the life he gained that turn to make a demon with power and toughness equal to the life paid. Vintage plays an island and casts his commander, Archelos Lagoon Mystic, making all permanents come into play untapped since he's untapped. I play a Seagate, naming red, so it taps for both red and blue, then casts Osari Sun's Glory, getting an experience counter from Kalemni, and getting an experience counter when Othari attacks, also making a tapped and attacking 2/2 rebel token for each experience counter I have. This lets me attack Bilal for 3 with Othari, getting an experience counter, gaining 3 life thanks to lifelink, and making 2 rebel tokens that are tapped and attacking Jason, one of which he blocks and kills, only taking 2. On Jason's turn, he immediately attacks Bilal for 3, letting them both draw 3 cards, and Jason makes 3 snake tokens. Then, in his second main phase, Jason casts Impact Tremors, doing 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters under his control. Once that's resolved, he casts Winds of Change, making each player shuffle their hand into their library and draw that many cards, meaning Jason draws 5, Bilal draws 8, Vintage draws 5, I draw 3, and Jason makes 16 snake tokens, doing 16 damage to each opponent. Finally, Jason plays an island and casts a Wayfarer's Bauble, then passes. Bilal plays a Fetid Heath and casts Soul Warden, letting him gain a life whenever another creature enters the battlefield. After that, he casts Karlov of the Ghost Council, putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it whenever he gains life, and being able to remove 6 of them to exile target creature. Thanks to the Soul Warden, he gains a life when it enters and immediately puts 2 counters on it. After that, he casts Soul's Attendant, exploring so that each of his opponents loses a life while Bilal gains 3, and this also gains him a life when it enters, so he puts another 4 counters on Karlov, and the Attendant now gains him an additional life whenever a creature enters the battlefield. Then he moves to combat, attacking Vintage for 4 with Tivash, but he blocks with Wall of Frost, preventing Tivash from untapping on Bilal's next turn, but Bilal still gains 4. In his second main phase, Sorin transforms into Sorin Ravenous Neonite, which still has Extort, and he activates his +2 ability to create a food token. At the end of turn, Tivash triggers, so Bilal pays 9 life to create a 9/9 demon token, gaining back 2 when it enters and putting 4 more counters on Karlov. Vintage plays a Temple of Malady, scrying 1, then casts Skursdog High Priest, which can tap and tap 2 other creatures he controls to create a 5/5 demon token, but only if a creature died this turn. This also gains Bilal 2 life and puts 4 more counters on Karlov. I cast a Propagator Drone, giving my creature tokens evolve, gaining Bilal 2, and then I attack Jason with Othari, getting an experience counter, creating 3 rebel tokens that are tapped and attacking Bilal, letting him gain 6 life, put 12 counters on Karlov, then he blocks with a Karlov and a demon, taking 2 and killing 2 of my rebels. Before damage, Jason sacrifices 3 snakes to do 3 damage to Othari, killing it so that he takes no damage. Then, at the end of turn, Jason sacrifices another 8 snakes to do 5 damage to Kalemni and 1 to both the Soul Warden and Soul's Attendant, killing all 3 creatures. Still at the end of turn, Jason sacrifices his Wayfarer's Bauble to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. On Jason's turn, he plays a Game Trail, revealing a mountain so it comes into play untapped, then attacks Bilal for 3 with Xyrus, letting them both draw 3, and letting Jason make 3 snakes, doing 3 damage to each of his opponents. Then, in his second main phase, he casts Jin-Gitaxias Progress Tyrant, letting him copy the first artifact, instant, or sorcery spell he casts each turn, while countering the first artifact, instant, or sorcery spell an opponent casts each turn. This also does another 1 damage to each of his opponents. Bilal plays a Vault of the Archangel, then attacks Vintage for 9 with his demon, and attacks Jason for 30 with Karlov. Vintage reveals he had a way to save himself, casting Take into Custody to tap the demon, but thanks to Jin-Gitaxias, it gets countered, so Vintage is knocked out of the game, while Jason blocks Karlov with a snake. Before the damage though, Bilal activates Vault of the Archangel, giving his creatures Death Touch and Lifelink, meaning he gains a total of 39 life and puts 4 more counters on Karlov. This means that in his second main phase, Bilal can activate Sorin's -1 ability to do 39 damage to Jason since he's gained 39 life this turn, knocking him out of the game. Before he's fully knocked out though, Jason goes down swinging, sacrificing all 12 of his creatures to do 12 damage to Bilal. On my turn, I play an island and activate Azlask, giving all of my creatures +3/+3, and since they're all Scions, they also get Indestructible and Annihilator 1. In response, Bilal activates Karlov, removing 2 counters from it to exile Azlask, and this lets me attack Bilal for 23 total damage, forcing him to sacrifice all his non-land permanents except for Karlov. Unfortunately for me, Karlov is still more than lethal on his own, so Bilal simply has to attack me with him on his turn, knocking me out and winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Everyone's deck kind of got to do what they wanted to do. It was very cool to see Vintage put up that Wall of Frost very early on and put his opponents in a situation where they really couldn't attack him because we didn't want our stuff to get tapped down. And so even just having that one blocker, I think, put him in a position where he was kind of set. He really didn't need to deal too much with what was happening because nobody was really going to attack him. And I thought it was kind of cool to see that as a feature. I've never thought about, Wall of Frost in that way before, so it was very cool to see. I think that Jason probably would have had the game on lock if it hadn't been for that Vault of Archangels from Bilal being able to gain him a ton of life. I think that him being able to kind of snipe down creatures with his Goblin Bombardment and Snake Generation was probably going to be enough to push him to a victory. But unfortunately, Bilal did wind up getting lifelink on a massive, I think it was 39 power or 30 power something Karlov to just -1 Sorin and just absolutely zap Jason out of the game, which is what I said I was scared of at the very beginning, so it makes sense. And then, of course, there's not much we could do at the end. We did put up a fight. I think that we did a pretty good job of amassing some experience counters. We had a couple of different experience counter commanders. We didn't quite get enough Eldrazi tokens, I don't think, but we were lucky enough to have the Leyline, so all of our stuff were Scions, meaning that they all got Annihilator and Indestructible, which I think is a kind of a cool piece that I didn't talk too much about in the deck text. So let me know what you all think. Let me know if there's any cards you think that we should add to the deck, or maybe any cards that shouldn't quite have made the cut in your opinion. And as always, if you have any suggestions for future videos, please do let me know down in the comments. I do love building around random cards, so if you've got some, let me know. Otherwise, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.